In 1974, a barefoot, completely unwashed 19-year-old who, by the way, smelled strongly of fruit, just walked into a Silicon Valley tech lobby and flatly refused to leave until he was hired.
Just planted himself, right?
So literally just sat there.
Mm-hmm.
And he was abrasive. He was, utterly convinced of his own genius. But within just a few years, he would fundamentally dictate how the modern world communicates, works, and, even thinks.
Yeah, it's wild.
It totally is. So today we are exploring the chaotic, completely contradictory blueprint of the personal computer revolution. We're doing a deep dive into how this bizarre collision of 1960s counterculture, Eastern spirituality, and hardcore Silicon Valley engineering forged the entire modern technological landscape.
Right, and it's all filtered through the intensely complex, fiercely guarded psychology of one guy, Steve Jobs.
Exactly. And to really unpack this, we are pulling from a phenomenal source. We've got these incredibly detailed excerpts from Walter Isaacson's exclusive biography of Steve Jobs.
Which is such a massive resource.
Yeah. Oh, it's huge, because what makes this source material so compelling is that Isaacson conducted over 40 interviews with Jobs himself over 2 years. And this is alongside scores of really candid, honestly, sometimes brutal interviews with his family, his friends, his rivals.
Yeah. And the key there is that Jobs didn't ask for any control over the manuscript.
Right.
He actually told people to speak honestly.
Yeah.
So we aren't getting this sanitized corporate history. We are getting the completely unvarnished truth about the perfectionism, the artistry, and the absolute compulsion for control that shaped him.
Absolutely. And just to give you, the listener, a sense of where we're heading today, this journey involves acid trips in wheat fields, a literal bomb scare in a high school locker, a covert prank call to the Vatican, and a guy who literally walked away from a $2.6 billion fortune for a mere $800.
You can't make this stuff up.
You really can't. Okay, let's unpack this.
Well, I think the best place to start is at the absolute beginning, right, with his foundational psychology. Yep. Because the reality is you just cannot fully grasp the intensely controlled, beautifully packaged ecosystems he built later in life without first understanding the profound lack of control he experienced the literal moment he was born.
Okay, so that brings us to 1955. Steve Jobs was adopted. And the circumstances around his birth and adoption are deeply rooted in, the social constraints of the 1950s.
Oh, very much so.
His biological mother, Joanne Schiebel, came from a really strict rural Wisconsin family, German descent, and she fell in love with a Syrian Muslim graduate student named Abdul Fattah Jandali.
Which in the 50s was
a massive deal. The social stigma was intense. Her dying father actually threatened to completely disown her if she married him. So feeling completely trapped by these rigid Catholic community norms, she quietly travels to San Francisco to a doctor who arranged closed adoptions.
And closed adoptions in that era, that meant the records were entirely sealed.
Right.
There was this veil of secrecy over the whole process.
Yeah.
But Joanne had one absolute non-negotiable requirement for whoever took her baby. They had to be college graduates.
She wanted to guarantee a certain trajectory.
Exactly. She wanted to lock in that success for him.
Right. And initially, the doctor arranged for a really successful lawyer and his wife to take the baby. But when the boy was actually born, they decided at the absolute last minute that they wanted a girl instead.
Wow.
So the baby gets passed down to the next couple on the list, which was Paul and Clara Jobs. Now, Paul was a high school dropout. He was a Coast Guard mechanic, worked as a repo man, a machinist. Clara was a bookkeeper. Neither of them had even come close to a college degree.
And Joanne was not happy about that.
Oh, she flat out refused to sign the adoption papers when she found out. She held out for weeks.
Yeah.
It created this super tense standoff where this newborn baby was essentially just floating in bureaucratic limbo.
Yeah, it wasn't until Paul and Clara signed a formal, legally binding pledge promising to fund a savings account specifically to pay for the boy's college education that Joanne finally relented.
She finally signed them. And Jobs knew about this from a really early age. He didn't find out later in life as some dark hidden secret. He had this incredibly vivid memory from when he was about 6 or 7 years old.
Right, the story with the girl across the street.
Yes. He's sitting on the grass, telling this neighborhood girl that he was adopted, and she looks at him and says, "So does that mean your real parents didn't want you?"
Ouch.
I know. And Jobs later recalled that it felt like actual lightning bolts went off in his head. He runs inside the house hysterically crying, and his parents, Paul and Clara, they stop what they're doing, look him straight in the eye, and say very slowly and deliberately, "No, you don't understand. We specifically picked you out."
And that phrase right there, we specifically picked you out. That is the absolute bedrock of his psychological makeup.
Yeah.
It created this really intense dichotomy, abandoned versus chosen.
Right.
Those two concepts became fiercely intertwined in his identity, and they honestly drove almost everything he did for the rest of his life.
So let's break that down mechanically, because
Yeah.
it's super easy to just say, oh, he had abandonment issues. But how does that specifically manifest in the way he operated a multi-billion-dollar tech company?
Well, being abandoned at birth leaves a deeply rooted subconscious psychological scar. It establishes this baseline feeling that the world is unpredictable, that the systems around you are fundamentally unsafe, completely outside of your control.
Which makes sense.
Right. For many people, that manifests as anxiety, or they just withdraw. But for someone with Jobs' particular drive, it manifested as an intense, almost tyrannical need to control his physical and professional environment.
He had to dictate the terms.
Exactly. If he couldn't control what happened to him at birth, he was going to compensate by demanding absolute end-to-end control over everything he created. The product essentially became an extension of his own ego, a protective bubble where he dictated every single rule.
But then you have the other side of the coin, which is being chosen. His parents didn't just say they loved him, they told him he was specifically selected from the masses.
Precisely.
Mhm.
So the abandonment fueled his ruthless drive for independence, right? But being chosen fueled an almost messianic sense of his own specialness.
Like he was destined for greatness.
Yeah. It instilled this profound belief that the normal rules of society, of business, even of physics, didn't necessarily apply to him. He felt destined to operate on a totally different plane.
And that feeling of operating on a different plane was reinforced really early on when he realized he actually was operating on a different intellectual level than the adults around him.
Oh, the carbon microphone story.
Yes, this is such a foundational story. Paul Jobs, his adoptive dad, was this brilliant mechanic. He could rebuild a whole car engine from scratch. And he tried to pass this mechanical affinity on to Steve. He set up a workbench in the family garage, taught him how things fit together.
Really practical stuff.
Right, and through this, Paul taught Steve some basic rudiments of electronics. Well, one day, a neighbor who worked as an engineer was showing young Steve how a carbon microphone, a simple battery, and a speaker could amplify a human voice without any complex circuitry at all.
And the mechanism there is super fascinating.
Yeah.
But it's very counterintuitive if you're used to modern electronics.
How does it actually work?
Well, inside a carbon microphone, there are these tiny carbon granules. When sound waves hit the diaphragm of the microphone, it compresses those granules.
Okay.
And that physical compression changes their electrical resistance. So if you run a simple battery current through it, the changing resistance directly modulates the current, which can then just drive a speaker. It's a very raw, direct analog process that essentially amplifies the signal physically.
Right. So young Steve sees this, runs home, and tells his dad. But his dad, who relies on his deep mechanical knowledge, says, no, that's impossible. A microphone always needs an electronic amplifier to boost the signal before it reaches the speaker.
He was sure of it.
Totally sure.
Hmm.
But Steve kept arguing, insisting he saw it with his own two eyes, and finally dragged his dad down the street to the neighbor's house just to prove it. And his dad was stunned. He was wrong. Jobs later said this was a massive, jarring realization for him. He realized in that exact moment that he was smarter than his parents. He felt a tremendous wave of guilt and shame for even thinking that, but he knew it was objectively true.
Which is a terrifying moment for a child.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we rely on the adults in our lives to be the ultimate arbiters of truth and capabilities, right? When you realize the adults in the room don't have all the answers, and in fact, that you might have a better grasp on reality than they do, you stop trusting authority.
To me, it feels like that moment a kid realizes the guardrails on the roller coaster aren't actually bolted down. Like, it's empowering because you suddenly see your own limitless potential, but it's deeply isolating because you realize nobody is actually driving the bus. You're entirely on your own.
That is a really perfect way to look at it. And if you add that intellectual isolation to the emotional isolation of being an adopted child who already feels set apart from the world, you get a personality that is fiercely independent, deeply suspicious of established norms, and completely, unwaveringly confident in its own intuition. He basically learned that his way was often the only right way.
What's wild is that his parents didn't try to suppress this at all. They didn't punish him for being arrogant. They completely adapted to him.
They catered to him, really.
They did. They realized he was gifted, and they bent their entire lives to his will. They fought with the local schools to keep him challenged. When he was being relentlessly bullied in middle school, he came home and gave them an absolute ultimatum. He said, either move me to a better school district right now, or I'm dropping out entirely.
And he was completely serious.
Oh, deadly serious. And his parents, who were a mechanic and a bookkeeper, scraped together every penny they had and moved the family to a better, much more expensive district in Los Altos.
Which inadvertently reinforced a highly dangerous lesson for him. It showed him early on that if he pushed hard enough, if he demanded something with enough sheer willpower, reality itself in this case, his parents' financial limitations would literally bend to accommodate him. This is the very seed of what would later be called his reality distortion field.
So true. Now, for everyone listening, I want you to take a second and think about the physical environment you grew up in. Think about your childhood home, your neighborhood, the objects you interacted with daily. How did those physical spaces shape your baseline subconscious understanding of what good design actually means? Because for Jobs, forcing his parents to move to Los Altos put him squarely inside an Eichler home.
And that architectural detail is incredibly significant.
Right.
Joseph Eichler was a post-war real estate developer
Yeah.
who had a very specific vision. He wanted to bring the high-end, modernist architectural concepts of Frank Lloyd Wright to the everyday American masses.
Yeah, these were mass-produced tract homes, but they weren't your typical boring suburban boxes. They were incredibly smartly designed. They featured post and beam construction, which allowed for these massive floor-to-ceiling glass walls that brought the outside in.
Beautiful homes.
They really were. They had open floor plans, clean geometric lines, and features like radiant heating built directly into the concrete slab floors. They were inexpensive, built for the working class, but they were undeniably elegant.
It democratized high design. And living in an Eichler home provided Jobs with his foundational aesthetic philosophy. He saw, quite literally, in the walls around him that you could bring clean, elegant, intuitive design to the mass market without making it wildly expensive or overly complicated.
You don't have to sacrifice beauty for utility.
Exactly. That exact philosophy became the original guiding vision for Apple. If you look at the original Macintosh or the iPod or the very first iPhone, they're essentially the digital equivalents of an Eichler home. Clean lines, hidden complexities, intuitive layouts, meant for everyday people.
It's astounding to think that the physical floor plan of a cheap 1960s tract home essentially laid the groundwork for the design language of a multi-trillion-dollar company decades later.
It really is.
But as confident as Jobs was in his aesthetic sensibilities and his intellect, he also had a very pragmatic self-awareness. He knew electronics, he knew how to hustle, but he knew he wasn't the absolute smartest hardware engineer in Silicon Valley. He wasn't a wizard.
No, he was a visionary, but vision requires execution. He needed a builder.
Right.
He needed someone whose brain operated on a level of pure, unadulterated engineering logic. Someone who could translate his abstract demands into physical functioning circuitry.
Enter Steve Wozniak, was done. This guy was a pure, unalloyed engineering genius. He was about 5 years older than Jobs, but emotionally, he was still very much a playful high school geek. And their backgrounds couldn't have been more polar opposite. Woz's dad, Jerry Wozniak, was a brilliant, highly disciplined rocket scientist working at Lockheed during the space race. Jerry instilled in Woz the belief that pure engineering was the absolute highest, most noble calling in the world.
Above everything else.
Yeah, he exalted the engineer as the pinnacle of human achievement, and he actively looked down on business, marketing, sales, and management as lesser, almost parasitic pursuits.
That's a crucial distinction. And Jerry also drilled a terrifying level of extreme honesty into Woz.
Yes.
Woz practically never lied. He didn't have a deceptive bone in his body. His entire motivation in life was driven by the sheer intrinsic joy of solving incredibly complex engineering puzzles. He wasn't driven by ambition, he wasn't driven by a desire for wealth or status, and he certainly wasn't driven by a need to control people.
Exactly. So while Jobs is over here obsessing over abandonment, enlightenment, and dominating his environment, Woz is literally sitting in his room trying to design entire computer architectures on paper just to see if he could do it using the absolute minimum number of microchips. It was a personal logic puzzle for him. And because he was so brilliant and honestly so bored, Woz was a massive, prolific prankster.
His pranks are legendary. And they really reveal the nature of his intellect. It was a playful, entirely non-malicious brand of rebellion that involved hacking physical systems.
Oh, they are incredible. When he was in 12th grade, Woz built an electronic metronome, but he tweaked it so it sounded exactly like a ticking bomb.
Of course he did.
He taped a bunch of big batteries to it, stuck it in a friend's locker, and rigged a crude switch so it would start ticking faster and faster when the locker door was open.
Oh my God.
So the high school principal finds it, thinks it's a legitimate explosive, bravely grabs it, runs out to the middle of the football field, clutching it to his chest, and yanks the wires off to defuse it. The police were called, and Woz got sent to the local juvenile detention center for the night.
And you have to mention what he did in juvie.
Oh, right. So what does he do while he's locked up? He teaches the other inmates how to disconnect the live wires from the ceiling fans and wire them directly to the metal bars of the cells so they could electrocute anyone who touched them.
It's hilarious, but it highlights how his brain just couldn't stop engineering. He saw the world as a series of interconnected systems that could be taken apart, understood, and rewired for his own amusement.
He also built this little pocket-sized device designed to jam television signals. He would walk into a crowded college dorm room where a bunch of people were glued to an episode of Star Trek. He'd secretly press a button in his pocket, broadcasting a disruptive frequency on that specific channel, and the TV screen would instantly turn to static.
Just to mess with them.
Exactly. The guys in the room would groan, someone would get up and whack the side of the TV or twist the rabbit ear antenna. The moment they touched the TV, Woz would let go of the button, the signal would clear up, and the person would think they fixed it.
It's a brilliant exercise in operant conditioning, honestly.
Totally. He would condition them over the course of an hour until he had some poor guy standing on one foot, touching the antenna with one finger, contorting his body into a pretzel, terrified to move an inch because he thought his physical body was acting as the antenna, grounding the signal. Was manipulating the technology to manipulate human behavior, just for a laugh.
But that deep understanding of systems of frequencies, signals, and how machines talk to each other that set the stage for the most pivotal collaboration of their early lives.
Which brings us to the ultimate hack, the true origin story of the Apple partnership. This is the story of the Blue Box. In 1971, Woz gets his hands on an issue of Esquire magazine and reads a fascinating article about a secretive subculture of hackers. They called themselves phone freaks, and they had figured out how to completely bypass the billing systems and make free, unlimited, long-distance phone calls anywhere in the world.
And to understand why this was even possible, we have to look at how AT&T built their network back then.
How did it work?
Well, at the time, the entire global telephone infrastructure relied on something called in-band signaling. This meant that the control signals, the audio tones that told the massive routing switches where to send the call, traveled over the exact same audio channel as the human voice.
Which is a massive security flaw, right?
A monumental one. It meant that if a user could perfectly mimic the specific audio frequencies the machines used to talk to each other, the network couldn't tell the difference between a legitimate routing command from an operator and a fake command from a teenager in a bedroom. The network implicitly trusted whatever tones came down the line. The Esquire article revealed that a famous phreaker named John Draper, who went by the alias Captain Crunch, discovered that a cheap plastic toy whistle given away inside boxes of Captain Crunch cereal emitted the exact, precise frequency of 2600 hertz. And 2600 hertz was the tone AT&T used to clear a trunk line and open it for routing.
So Woz reads this and his mind just explodes. He immediately calls Jobs. They realize that while the 2600 hertz tone gets you into the system, they need the specific multi-frequency tones to actually dial the numbers.
Right, they needed the codes.
Exactly. They deduce that these highly classified frequencies are probably documented in an obscure, highly technical publication called the Bell System Technical Journal. So on a Sunday afternoon, they break into the library at the Stanford Linear Accelerator Center. They actually knew a side door that was usually left unlocked, and they scour the stacks. They find the journal, and boom, all the frequencies are listed right there in black and white.
Now, most phone freaks at the time were building analog tone generators. They used variable resistors and capacitors to tune the frequencies. But analog components drift, They get affected by temperature and humidity, meaning the tones weren't always perfectly accurate.
Right.
Woz decides he's going to build a digital tone generator. Nobody had ever built a digital one for this purpose.
What's the advantage of going digital there?
Precision. A digital circuit uses a quartz crystal oscillator to divine time perfectly, meaning it generates the exact required frequency every single time, without fail. Was spent weeks designing this brilliant, hyper-efficient circuit board, obsessing over reducing the chip count. When it was finally done, they had to test it. They hook it up to a phone, punch in the tones, and try to call Wooz's uncle in Los Angeles. They get a wrong number, but the crucial thing is the call goes through.
They did it.
Yeah, they're bypassing the toll system. They're making free long-distance calls.
And because it's Woz, he immediately escalates it to the highest prank possible. They decide to call the Vatican.
Oh, this is legendary.
Woz gets on the line, perfectly mimics a heavy German accent, and pretends to be U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, demanding to speak to the Pope about an urgent global crisis.
They actually managed to route the call through London, across the transatlantic cables and into the Vatican switchboard. They got a confused bishop on the line who was scrambling to find a translator, but they didn't quite wake up the Pope.
But here is the absolute critical pivot point in this story. Woz has built this miraculous, highly illegal device. He is completely satisfied just using it to pull elaborate pranks and show off to his engineering buddies. But Jobs steps in. Jobs looks at this raw circuit board and doesn't just see a prank. He sees a product. He sees a business.
This dynamic is the exact template for everything that follows in their lives.
It really is. Jobs scrounges up the components to build a casing. He sources a power supply. He buys a 16-key keypad to make it look professional. He figures out that the raw materials cost them about $40 per unit. Woz would have given them away for free, but Jobs firmly decides they're going to assemble them and sell them to college students for $150 a pop.
It's audacious. I mean, think about the irony here. The corporate origin story of Apple, a company that now defines global corporate compliance and security, is fundamentally rooted in the mass manufacturing and distribution of a device designed specifically to commit federal wire fraud.
It's staggering. Wozniak invents this brilliant technology purely for the intrinsic joy of solving an engineering hurdle. Jobs steps in, recognizes the commercial application, creates the user interface, the casing, and the keypad figures out the supply chain, sets the pricing strategy, and aggressively monetizes it.
And they were successful for a while. They sold roughly 100 blue boxes out of dorm rooms, but the venture came to a terrifying halt.
Yeah, they were trying to offload one to a guy in the parking lot of a pizza parlor in Sunnyvale. Jobs is standing at a payphone, demonstrating how it works, and the potential buyer says he needs to get the money from his car. The guy walks to his car, turns around, pulls out a handgun, points it directly at Jobs' stomach, and robs them of the blue box.
A sobering, terrifying dose of reality right there. But despite getting robbed at gunpoint, the broader psychological takeaway from the entire blue box era was profoundly empowering for both of them.
Jobs explicitly stated later in his life that if it hadn't been for the blue boxes, there wouldn't have been an Apple. They realized that they, two young, scruffy kids operating out of a suburban garage, could build a tiny piece of circuitry that could completely seize control of a multi-billion-dollar global infrastructure like the AT&T phone network.
That realization is deeply intoxicating, especially for someone like Jobs, who craved control over his environment. It instilled in them the ultimate unwavering confidence that they could literally bend the world to their will. It proved that massive, intimidating, complex systems were not impenetrable magic. They were just machines.
Right.
And machines could be understood, they could be hacked, and they could be mastered by individuals. That specific realization is the foundational ethos of the entire personal computer revolution.
So they've tasted this incredible, almost godlike power over external global systems. But Jobs, being the deeply restless soul that he is, doesn't just stop there. As we move into the 1970s, he takes that intense, laser-like focus and turns it entirely inward. He realizes that controlling the phone company is one thing, but he wants to seek control and ultimate enlightenment over his own mind.
The spiritual journey begins.
Exactly. So he enrolls at Reed College in Oregon. Now, Reed was a very expensive, highly rigorous liberal arts school, heavily steeped in the hippie counterculture. His parents basically spent their entire life savings, that college fund they promised Joanne Schiebel to send him there. And almost immediately upon arriving, he drops out.
He fundamentally rejected the structured curriculum. He refused to take the required courses that didn't interest him, and he later claimed he felt incredibly guilty spending his working-class parents' savings on an education he found pointless.
But the dean of the college saw something in him and allowed him to stay on campus, sleep on the floors of his friends' dorms, and audit whatever classes he wanted without paying tuition. He dropped out, but he essentially dropped in. And one of the classes he dropped in on was a course on calligraphy.
Which seems so random, but
Oh, it becomes huge. He learned about serif and sans serif typefaces, about kerning, which is the stroke between different letter combinations, about leading, and about the deep historical artistry of typography.
and this highlights one of the most vital traits of Jobs' genius. A purely logical, hyper-rational engineering student would view calligraphy as utterly useless. But Jobs saw the beauty in it. Decades later, when they were designing the first Macintosh, that seemingly random artistic pursuit in college is exactly why the Mac was the first computer to feature beautiful, proportionally spaced fonts. He was standing directly at the intersection of the humanities and the sciences.
But his life at Reed wasn't just about beautiful fonts. He was pushing his physical and mental limits to the absolute extreme. He was reading dense books on Eastern spirituality like Baba Ram Dass's Be Here Now. He and his close friend Daniel Kotke became hardcore vegetarians. And I don't mean they just stopped eating meat. Jobs would go on these extreme, punishing diets.
Oh yeah, the diets were intense.
He would eat nothing but Roman meal cereal for a week, or he'd eat nothing but carrots for weeks on end, to the point where his skin literally absorbed the beta-carotene and turned a visible sunset orange hue.
He became obsessed with books like The Mucusless Diet Healing System by Arnold Ehret. Ehret preached that eating only fruits and starchless vegetables would prevent the body from forming harmful mucus, which he believed was the root of all disease.
So why do you think he was doing this? I mean, was it just a hippie phase, or was there something deeper mechanically happening in his head?
It was absolutely about control. Just like he wanted to hack the phone system, he was trying to hack his own physiology. By starving himself or restricting his inputs to just one type of fruit, he was asserting absolute dominance over his bodily urges. He was trying to purge himself of impurities, seeking a kind of ascetic perfection.
He actually convinced himself that his fruitarian diet was so pure that his body no longer produced mucus or body odor, so he completely stopped using deodorant and stopped showering regularly, which, as you can imagine, did not work out well for anyone forced to sit next to him.
Not at all.
He was doing week-long fasts, seeking this intense spiritual vitality. And it's during this highly vulnerable searching period that he falls under the spell of a guy named Robert Friedland.
Robert Friedland is one of the most fascinating, consequential characters in the early Jobs mythos.
For sure. Friedland was an older student at Reed. He was incredibly charismatic, wealthy, and had a dark past. He was a former LSD dealer who had actually done time in a federal prison. He ran a commune on an expansive apple orchard called the All-One Farm. Jobs would go out there, sleep in the barn, and prune the Gravenstein apple trees. Friedland had this intense, almost dictatorial charisma that completely captivated Jobs.
According to many of Jobs' friends who were there, Friedland operated almost like a cult leader. He was a master manipulator who could bend social situations entirely to his strong will. He taught Jobs how to walk into a room and instantly be the center of attention.
Right.
He taught him how to stare people down without blinking, how to use silence as a weapon, and how to project absolute certainty. Friedland was the original architect of the reality distortion field that Jobs would later perfect.
Jobs absorbed all of this. He admired the raw power Friedland had over the people on the commune. But Jobs also took the spiritual questing very seriously. In 1974, he decides he needs to go straight to the source. He travels to India with his friend Daniel Kotke, specifically to seek out a highly revered Hindu guru named Neem Karoli Baba.
It was the classic 1970s pilgrimage for enlightenment, following in the footsteps of the Beatles and countless others.
But the reality of the trip was brutal, not romantic. He arrives in New Delhi in April during the crushing heat of the Indian summer. He drinks unpurified water almost immediately, contracts a severe case of dysentery, and his weight plummets from 160 pounds to a skeletal 120 pounds in a matter of days.
Sort of a low start.
Seriously, he wanders up into the Himalayas only to discover that the specific guru he traveled across the world to find had actually died several months earlier. During his wanderings, he gets grabbed by a manic holy man who forcefully drags him up a hill, lathers his head with soap, and shaves him completely bald with a dull straight razor. He ends up spending 7 months wandering through rural Indian villages.
And what he brings back from that grueling journey isn't just a shaved head and a bag of Indian robes. He brings back a profound, foundational, philosophical shift in how he views human intelligence.
Right. He observed that the people in the Indian countryside didn't use their intellect or rational analysis the way Westerners did. They relied deeply on intuition. And Jobs came to the conclusion that intuition is actually a far more powerful, far more advanced tool than empirical intellect. He brought this concept of experiential wisdom back to California, where he began intensively studying Zen Buddhism under a master named Kobun Chino.
He was really searching.
He was. He even engaged in primal scream therapy to try and excise the deep, lingering pain of his adoption. He was desperately, agonizingly trying to find inner peace.
And that search for peace is a big part of his story.
It is, but here's where I have to push back hard on the romanticism of this whole era. We picture the Zen seeker as calm, empathetic, and peaceful, but Jobs during this exact period could be absolutely unbearable and, frankly, incredibly cruel.
Oh, without a doubt.
There is this story about his girlfriend at the time, Chrisanne Brennan. One time, he shows up unannounced, demands that she come with him to Friedland's farm, and tells her she has to drive his car. The problem is she doesn't know how to drive a manual transmission. She's never driven a stick shift.
That's a recipe for disaster.
He ignores her protests, forces her to get behind the wheel, makes her shift up to 55 miles per hour on the open highway, puts on a Bob Dylan tape, lays his head down in her lap, and literally goes to sleep. He put his own life and hers in the hands of an untrained driver just to prove a point about sheer willpower. That isn't Zen peace. That is terrifying, reckless manipulation.
It is deeply terrifying, and it serves as a perfect, chilling example of his emerging reality distortion field in practice. What's crucial to understand here is how Jobs took these spiritual concepts and weaponized them.
Weaponized spirituality. Explain how you weaponize Zen.
Well, the traditional goal of Zen meditation is to achieve a state of calm, to dissolve the ego, and to accept the world as it is, right? Jobs didn't do that. He didn't meditate to find peace. He meditated to hone his focus into a laser beam. He took the Zen concept of experiential wisdom, that deep gut-level intuition, and turned it into a practical cutthroat business tool. He realized that abstract, logical, rational analysis, the kind taught in engineering schools or business schools, is often the worst possible way to design a product for a human being.
Because it's too cold.
Exactly. Western engineering relies on cold logic. Jobs relied on honed intuition to sense exactly what a user would feel when they touched a device. And when you combine that intuitive certainty with the dictatorial, manipulative willpower he learned from Friedland, you get a terrifying leader. He truly believed that if his intuition said something should happen, his sheer will could force reality to conform, whether that meant forcing a terrified girlfriend to drive a stick shift, or later forcing an exhausted engineer to shrink a circuit board to impossible dimensions.
So all of this intense spiritual seeking and cross-cultural wandering required cash. You can't just wander the Himalayas and live on an apple farm forever without money. And this pressing need for cash brings him right to the front doors of Atari, creating this surreal bridge between his barefoot countercultural lifestyle and the rapidly exploding Silicon Valley tech industry.
It is one of the most bizarre, jarring collisions of cultures in business history.
It's 1974. Jobs walks into the corporate lobby of Atari. He is wearing sandals, his hair is wild, he smells absolutely terrible, and he flatly demands a job, telling the receptionist he refuses to leave the building until they hire him.
The audacity.
Right. Now, Atari at this time was completely wild. The founder, Nolan Bushnell, was a brilliant, highly charismatic entrepreneur who regularly held corporate staff meetings sitting in a hot tub while smoking dope.
It was a very different time.
Bushnell's chief engineer, Al Alcorn, is the guy who comes out to the lobby to deal with this hippie kid. Alcorn asks him a few questions, sees a spark of raw intelligence in him, and surprisingly hires him as a low-level technician for $5 an hour.
But the reality of working with Jobs was a nightmare. His hygiene and his incredibly abrasive personality instantly caused chaos on the engineering floor.
His coworkers actively despised him. He would openly call senior engineers dumb shits to their faces if he thought their designs were inelegant. And he still firmly believed that his extreme fruit diet eliminated his body odor, so he was essentially never showering.
Oh, man.
The complaints were so severe that Bushnell was forced to make a special arrangement. He moved Jobs to the night shift, completely alone, just to save him from being fired or physically assaulted by the rest of the staff. Jobs would come in after everyone left and work through the night. But during this time, he actually bonded with Bushnell. They would sit around in the middle of the night having deep philosophical debates about free will versus determinism.
Bushnell became a vitally important mentor to Jobs. He recognized Jobs' drive, and he taught him a crucial Machiavellian lesson in leadership and manipulation. If you act like you can do something, it will usually work. Bushnell taught him that if you simply pretend to be completely in control of a situation, people will automatically assume that you are.
It's the ultimate fake it till you make it philosophy. but executed with absolute, unblinking conviction. And Bushnell also imparted a design philosophy that deeply resonated with Jobs' Zen sensibilities. Atari's arcade games had to be simple enough for a stone college kid in a noisy bar to figure out instantly, without reading a manual. The physical instructions printed on the cabinet for their Star Trek game were literally 2 steps. 1, insert quarter. 2, avoid Klingons.
That concept of radical simplicity, the total elimination of a user manual, became the foundational cornerstone of Apple's entire product design ethos. A device should explain itself the moment you look at it.
But the Atari era also contains one of the darkest, most revealing stories about Jobs' character and his moral flexibility. Bushnell has this idea for a new arcade game. He wants to design a single-player version of their massive hit Pong, and he wants to call it Breakout. He needs the prototype designed fast, and he offers a standard fee, plus a massive cash bonus for every single microchip eliminated from the final design under a 50-chip baseline.
A huge incentive.
Now, Bushnell knows perfectly well that Jobs isn't a great hardware engineer. He can't design this. But Bushnell also knows Jobs is best friends with Wozniak, and he assumes Jobs will drag Woz into it.
Which is exactly what happens. Jobs immediately recruits Woz.
Yeah.
But he frames the entire project through a web of lies.
Right. First, Jobs tells Woz they have to complete the entire complex design in just 4 days. This was a completely fabricated deadline. Jobs just wanted to get it done quickly so he could go back up to the Apple farm in Oregon. But the most crucial lie was about the money. Jobs tells Woz about the base fee, but completely hides the existence of the lucrative bonus for the saved chips.
Let's look at the mechanics of why the chip count mattered. In arcade cabinets back then, every extra microchip took up physical space on the board, generated excess heat, drew more power, and increased the manufacturing cost of every single machine rolling off the assembly line. Reducing the chip count was the holy grail of hardware engineering. Wozniak was uniquely, globally gifted at this.
So Woz takes the challenge. He stays awake for 4 nights straight. During the day, he works his full-time engineering job at Hewlett-Packard. At night, he goes to Atari, stands in front of a whiteboard, and designs the intricate logic of Breakout, while Jobs sits there physically wire-wrapping the board according to Woz's schematics.
And he pulls it off.
Woz pulls off an absolute miracle. He designs the entire game using an astonishingly low 45 chips. It was so tightly engineered that the Atari manufacturing technicians couldn't even understand how it worked. Bushnell is thrilled. He pays out the base fee, plus a substantial multi-thousand-dollar bonus for the saved chips. Jobs takes the money, gives Woz exactly half of the small base fee, and secretly pockets the entire massive bonus for himself.
And Wozniak, being so trusting, didn't find out about this betrayal for 10 full years. He only discovered it when he was reading a published book about the history of Atari in the 1980s.
I have to pause here. I want to ask you, and I want you listening to think deeply about this. How do you possibly reconcile this behavior? How do you reconcile the Zen-seeking, ascetic Jobs, the guy who spent months meditating in India, reading spiritual texts, actively trying to dissolve his ego, and live purely with the guy who coldly swindles his incredibly sweet, naive best friend out of thousands of dollars while watching him stay awake for 4 days straight?
Is the ultimate paradox of his life, and it highlights a defining, chilling contradiction in Jobs' character. Jobs possessed an intensely binary view of the world and everyone in it. You were either a genius or a bozo. You were either useful or useless. He deeply valued Wozniak's engineering genius because it was the vehicle for his own ambitions. But he simultaneously viewed Wozniak's innate goodness, his naivete, and his pure honesty as a fundamental weakness. And in the reality distortion field of Steve Jobs, a weakness was something to be aggressively exploited if it served his broader goals. He likely rationalized the theft internally by convincing himself that he needed the money more to fund his spiritual journey or his grand ambitions. He viewed it as a necessary, pragmatic action for the greater good of his own destiny. It demonstrates a truly terrifying ability to completely compartmentalize his ethics.
So we have all these combustible elements coming together. We have the sheer technical wizardry wars honed over years of hacking, one of the unshadable confidence Jobs gained from manipulating the phone network with the blue box. And we have the ruthless Machiavellian hustle and deep appreciation for intuitive design Jobs absorbed at Atari. All of this culminates in Wozniak's ultimate physical invention and Jobs' ultimate commercial hustle. We have arrived at the birth of Apple.
And the physical crucible where this birth happened was the Homebrew Computer Club in 1975. This club was the absolute perfect manifestation of the fusion between the hardcore electronics hackers and the utopian hippies.
The Homebrew Club met in a dusty auditorium in Menlo Park. It was filled with guys who read the whole Earth catalog, people who viewed giant corporate mainframe computers as tools of Orwellian control. Their rallying cry was literally, "Computer power to the people." They wanted to democratize computing. Wozniak goes to the very first meeting and someone hands him a specification sheet for a brand new piece of technology, a microprocessor. And looking at that sheet, Woz has a massive, world-altering insight.
To understand the magnitude of this insight, we have to look at the computing paradigm of 1975. Computers were massive, room-sized mainframes owned by the military or massive corporations. If you wanted to use one, you had a dumb terminal, basically just a keyboard and a screen that had to be wired directly into the mainframe to borrow its processing power.
But Woz looks at this new microprocessor, which is essentially an entire computer's brain shrunk down onto a single tiny chip, and he realizes he can bypass the mainframe entirely. He realizes that with a microprocessor, he could put the computing power inside the terminal itself. He envisions a keyboard, a screen, and a computer brain, all fully integrated into one single standalone package sitting on a desk.
It was revolutionary.
He immediately starts sketching out the architecture on paper. He buys a cheap microprocessor for $20. He solders the circuit board in his cubicle at HP after hours. He writes the software code entirely by hand because he can't afford actual computer time to compile it. And then on a Sunday night, June 29th, 1975, history literally happens.
Woz connects his circuit board to a keyboard and a standard television set. He types a letter on the keyboard, and instantly that letter appears on the television screen.
Wow.
It was the first time in human history that anyone had ever typed a character on a keyboard and seen it show up on their own personal computer screen right in front of them. It was a paradigm shift of unimaginable proportions.
Jobs sees this prototype, and his mind immediately starts racing. While Woz is just marveling at the technical achievement, Jobs is asking aggressive questions. Can it be networked? Can we add memory chips? And this immediate difference in perspective leads to a massive foundational clash of ethos between the two friends. Wozniak, staying completely true to the utopian hacker spirit of the Homebrew Club, wants to take his highly valuable schematics and simply give them away for free to anyone who asks. He said his only motivation was to give to help others. He had absolutely zero desire to commercialize it.
But Jobs, who had completely rejected the anti-commercialism of the hippie movement after his time at Atari, looks at this board and sees a multi-million-dollar business.
Jobs argues with Woz. He says, look, people are lazy, they don't have the time or the skill to source the parts and solder these complex boards themselves. Why don't we just print the raw circuit boards and sell them the convenience? Woz is highly skeptical, worried they'll lose money, but Jobs pitches it not as a business, but as an adventure. Jobs tells him, even if we lose our money, at least we'll have had a company. That appeals to Woz.
That's the hook.
Right. So Woz sells his prized HP scientific calculator, Jobs sells his beloved VW bus, and they scrape together about $1,300 in working capital. They decide to price the bare circuit board at exactly $666.66, not for any satanic reason, but simply because Wozniak found typing repeating digits mathematically pleasing.
And they needed a name for this new venture.
Jobs had just come back from a stint pruning trees at Friedland's All-One Farm. He suggests Apple Computer. He was still on his extreme fruitarian diet, and he felt that the word Apple was friendly, non-threatening, and took the hard, intimidating, metallic edge off the word computer. Plus, the pragmatic hustler in him realized that Apple would place them ahead of Atari in the alphabetical phone book listings.
It was a stroke of branding genius. It was friendly, slightly countercultural, but deeply traditionally American.
But to formally create the partnership, Jobs realizes a critical flaw. He needs a way to control Woz. Woz still felt a moral obligation to give his designs to his employer, Hewlett-Packard. So Jobs brings in Ron Wayne. Wayne was an older, cynical guy Jobs had met at Atari, someone who had previously tried and failed at running his own slot machine business. Jobs offers Wayne a 10% equity stake in Apple, simply to act as the adult in the room and the ultimate tiebreaker in any disputes between him and Woz. Wayne agrees, and being a methodical guy, he drafts a highly complex, legalese-heavy partnership agreement.
But Wayne gets cold feet almost immediately, in fact, just 11 days later.
Yeah, 11 days. Wayne reads the fine print of his own contract and realizes the terrifying reality of a general partnership. In a general partnership, all partners are jointly and severally liable for any debts the company incurs. Jobs has no money. Woz has no money. But Ron Wayne has a house, a car, and gold coins hidden in his mattress.
He had everything to lose.
Exactly. He realizes that if Jobs' reckless ambition puts them in debt, the creditors will come straight for Wayne's assets. He is absolutely terrified of total financial ruin. So he drafts a formal statement of withdrawal, sells his 10% stake back to them for $800, and walks away forever. To put that in perspective, that 10% stake would be worth roughly $2.6 billion today.
It is widely considered one of the most famously catastrophic business decisions in human history.
But this is where I want to challenge the narrative. We all laugh at Ron Wayne. I used to compare him to the guy who left the Beatles right before they went on the Ed Sullivan Show. But looking at the actual mechanics of the situation, I mean, was Wayne's fear actually completely rational? I mean, given Jobs' known erratic behavior, his abrasiveness, his lack of assets, and his willingness to take on massive debt, wasn't a purely logical person completely right to be terrified and run away?
That is the exact crux of the issue, and it raises a profound question about the fundamental nature of entrepreneurship. Yes, Wayne's fear was entirely 100% rational. The vast majority of startups fail completely. Jobs was erratic, he was alienating suppliers, and he was taking on dangerous levels of debt. A purely logical, risk-averse person evaluating the data would absolutely walk away.
Right.
But here's the secret. True, revolutionary entrepreneurship requires a complete suspension of pure logic. It requires an operational reality distortion field. Wayne looked at the situation and saw only the devastating risk. Jobs looked at the exact same situation and saw only the absolute inevitability of his own massive success. Jobs forced Wozniak out of the safe hobbyist realm and violently shoved him into the ruthless commercial realm. In doing so, he fundamentally changed computing from a weekend tinkering activity in garages into a massive global retail industry. You desperately need the irrational, borderline delusional drive of a Steve Jobs to create a paradigm-shifting revolution. Rationality, like Ron Wayne's, keeps your assets safe, but it guarantees you remain small.
And we see that irrational hustle pay off immediately. Jobs takes the Finnish Apple iBoard to a local computer shop called the Byte Shop, run by a guy named Paul Terrell. Jobs pitches the board. Terrell says he'll buy 50 of them, but with a massive catch. He will only buy fully assembled computers, not bare boards that require soldering. If Jobs delivers 50 assembled units, Terrell will pay $500 cash on delivery per unit.
This represents a massive, terrifying leap for them. To build 50 assembled boards, they need $15,000 in raw parts, and they have absolutely zero capital.
So Jobs goes into full hustle mode. He goes to banks, they reject him. He goes to parts suppliers, they laugh him out of the room. Finally, he walks into Kramer Electronics and simply waves the signed purchase order from the Byte Shop in the manager's face. The manager is skeptical, calls Paul Terrell at the Byte Shop, verifies the order is real, and based entirely on that paper promise, gives Jobs 30 days of credit for $15,000 worth of parts.
It's incredible.
Jobs runs home. They turn the Jobs family garage into a sweatshop assembly line. Jobs' pregnant sister, his high school friends, they sit there day and night soldering and testing these boards. They deliver the units to the Byte Shop on day 29 just in time to pay off the credit. Apple is officially a profitable company.
It's a triumph of sheer will. But the Apple I, for all its success, was still just a raw circuit board. The user still had to build their own wooden case, supply their own keyboard, and wire up their own television monitor. It was a stepping stone, not a revolution.
Exactly. And Jobs realizes this viscerally when he takes the Apple I to the Personal Computer Festival in Atlantic City in 1976. He walks the convention floor and looks at the competition. Functionally, the Apple I is vastly superior to everything else because of Woz's brilliant chip architecture. But aesthetically, it looks terrible. It's a scruffy, exposed green board. Other computers on the floor, like the SOL-20, have sleek metal cases and built-in keyboards. They look like professional machines. Jobs has a massive, blinding epiphany. He realizes that the future of computing doesn't belong to the hobbyists who want to solder. The future belongs to the fully integrated, beautifully packaged, plug-and-play consumer appliance.
This is the exact moment the vision for the Apple III is born. He envisions an end-to-end product where the user doesn't have to think about what's inside the box.
Jobs decides the Apple II needs a revolutionary case. He literally wanders the aisles of a Macy's department store, staring at Cuisinart food processors, admiring their sleek molded plastic lines. He decides he wants a lightweight, molded plastic case, completely rejecting the clunky sheet metal everyone else is using. He hires an industrial design consultant to shape it. But then he tackles a deeper mechanical problem, the power supply. Jobs absolutely hates the loud, whirring fans that every computer needs to keep from melting. They aren't zen. They interrupt the calm experience he wants the user to have. So he hires Rod Holt, a brilliant chain-smoking Marxist engineer he knew from Atari, to fix it.
And the mechanical solution Holt came up with is one of the most unsung but vital inventions in computing history. Traditional computers use linear power supplies. These use massive, heavy copper transformers to step down the voltage from the wall. The problem is, linear power supplies are incredibly inefficient. They bleed off the excess power as massive amounts of heat. Therefore, you must have a loud fan to blow that heat out of the case.
So how did Holt solve it?
Holt designed a switching power supply. Instead of acting like a dam holding back the power and overflowing his heat, a switching power supply turns the incoming electrical current on and off thousands of times a second, drawing only the exact micro amount of power the computer needs at that exact millisecond. Because it doesn't waste energy, it barely generates any heat. It runs completely cool. It doesn't need a fan.
Wow.
The machine is silent. It was a revolutionary piece of engineering, and virtually every single computer, television, and smartphone charger you use today relies on a descendant of Rod Holt's switching power supply.
But this relentless, obsessive push for a perfect, seamlessly integrated package leads to a massive philosophical clash with Wozniak. Woz, embodying the ultimate hacker ethos, wants the Apple II to have 8 expansion slots in the back. He wants users to be able to open the case, plug in their own custom circuit boards, and modify the machine however they want. Jobs, fiercely obsessed with controlling the end-to-end user experience, insists the machine should only have 2 slots, one for a printer and one for a modem.
Wozniak actually won that specific battle over the Apple II slots, largely because Jobs knew Woz was still the only engineer on Earth capable of actually building the motherboard. But that argument drew the permanent battle lines for the future of Apple.
Jobs realizes that tooling this custom plastic case and launching this machine as a mass-market appliance is going to cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. They desperately need a real investor. They get connected with Don Valentine, a legendary venture capitalist. Valentine drives up to the garage in a Mercedes, takes one look at Jobs, who is still refusing to shower, wearing sandals, and looking, in Valentine's words, like Ho Chi Minh, and Valentine says he will only invest his money if they bring in a seasoned executive who actually understands marketing and distribution. He gives Jobs 3 names. Jobs calls the first one a man named Mike Markkula.
Markkula is the critical missing piece of the Apple puzzle. He was 33 years old, independently wealthy after retiring early with Intel stock options, drove a gold Corvette, and deeply understood the mechanics of corporate growth.
Markkula comes to the garage, looks at Woz's machine, and is absolutely blown away by the potential. He writes a comprehensive business plan, personally guarantees a $250,000 line of credit, and takes a 1/3 stake in Apple, becoming equal partners with Jobs and Woz. But more importantly, he becomes a father figure to Jobs, teaching him the absolute psychological essentials of marketing. Markkula wrote a highly influential 1-page paper on Apple's marketing philosophy that contained 3 core principles: empathy, focus, and impute.
Empathy meant intimately understanding customer needs better than any other company. Focus meant violently eliminating unimportant opportunities to concentrate on the core product. But impute is the most fascinating and the most uniquely Jobsian concept.
Let's really drill down into this. What does impute actually mean? The word itself is archaic, but the psychological concept is brilliant. Markkula wrote in his memo, "People do judge a book by its cover. We may have the best product, the highest quality, the most useful software. If we present them in a slipshod manner, they will be perceived as slipshod. If we present them in a creative, professional manner, we will impute the desired qualities. Think about the smartphone in your pocket right now, or the laptop on your desk. The reason the box it came in was made of heavy premium cardboard, the reason the plastic peeled off with a satisfying resistance that isn't an accident. Jobs took the concept of impute to heart. From the Apple II all the way to the unboxing experience of a modern iPhone, he understood that the tactile packaging, the visual presentation, subconsciously sets the tone for how you perceive the value of what's inside before you even turn it on.
To perfectly execute this concept of impute, they hired Regis McKenna, the premier public relations executive in Silicon Valley. McKenna's team was tasked with designing a new logo. They completely scrapped Ron Wayne's overly complex, Victorian-style ink drawing of Isaac Newton, and they created this simple, iconic apple shape with a single bite taken out of it for scale. They colored it with vibrant, psychedelic horizontal stripes. It was incredibly expensive to print those 6 colors on a casing, but Jobs insisted on it because the colors imputed friendliness, approachability, and high-end sophistication.
But as Apple rapidly grows from a garage into a massive corporation, Jobs' behavior becomes increasingly toxic. He is tyrannical, he viciously belittles programmers, he cries when he doesn't get his way, and he still smells terrible. Markula hates confrontation, so he brings in a tough executive named Mike Scott to be the president of Apple, specifically to act as a babysitter to manage Jobs.
Scott was highly experienced, tough as nails, and essentially the very first person Jobs ever met who wouldn't just fold and bend to his reality distortion field.
They fought constantly over the most minute details. Jobs wanted custom, pure white engineering benches. Scott insisted on standard industrial gray to save money. Jobs demanded a one-year warranty on the Apple II. Scott pointed out the industry standard was 90 days. But the most epic, ridiculous fight was over employee badge numbers. As they were issuing security badges, Scott assigned #1 to Wozniak because Woz was the creator of the technology, and #2 to Jobs. Jobs threw an absolute tantrum. He cried in the office. He aggressively demanded to be #1. Scott, holding his ground, flatly refused. Finally, Jobs comes back with a bizarre workaround. He declares that he will be employee #0.
It perfectly, almost comically, encapsulates his overwhelming ego. He absolutely had to be ahead of everyone else in the hierarchy, even if it meant stepping entirely outside the boundaries of a normal numerical sequence.
And as we unpack all of this, the Apple II launches, it becomes a staggering, unprecedented success, and it single-handedly creates the modern personal computer industry. But I want to go back to that specific battle over the expansion slots on the back of the machine, because I think that argument between Woz and Jobs tells us absolutely everything about the future of technology.
It truly does. What you are seeing in that argument is the classic, defining philosophical battle of the digital age. Open versus closed systems. Wozniak, rooted in the homebrew hacker ethos, believed passionately in an open system. He wanted users to tinker, to modify, to jack their own hardware into his creation. Think of it like buying a classic muscle car, where you are encouraged to open the hood, swap out the carburetor, and tune the engine yourself. Jobs, conversely, demanded a closed system. Think of Jobs' vision as buying a beautifully designed, flawlessly engineered sports car where the hood is permanently welded shut at the factory.
And why did he demand the welded hood? It wasn't just about aesthetics, was it?
No, it goes all the way back to the beginning of our deep dive. It goes back to the psychology of a child who was abandoned. His deep-seated lack of control over his own origins manifested in a relentless, uncompromising drive to create a perfectly closed, beautifully curated ecosystem where he controlled every single aspect of the user's experience. He didn't want you opening the case. He didn't want you messing with his perfect creation because that introduced chaos and unpredictability. That intense psychological need for control became the literal DNA of Apple's product line, and it is a philosophy that persists in their unopenable phones and closed software ecosystems to this very day.
It's an incredible realization. We have taken quite a profound journey today. We have examined how a fiercely driven, abandoned, and adopted kid from the tract homes of Silicon Valley blended the experiential, intuitive wisdom of Eastern mysticism, the rebellious, anti-authoritarian hacker ethos of the 1960s counterculture, and the ruthless, perfectionist hustle of American capitalism. He took a brilliant, naive engineer's weekend logic puzzle and violently forced it into a fully packaged, beautifully designed mass-market revolution that changed human history.
And while Jobs was undeniably abrasive, deeply manipulative, and incredibly difficult to be around, his underlying operational lesson remains incredibly powerful for anyone trying to build something new. The most profound, world-altering innovation almost never comes from staying safely in one academic or professional lane. It comes from violently connecting distinct, opposing fields. Jobs stood firmly at the intersection of the humanities and the sciences. He brought calligraphy, artistry, and intuitive human design to cold, rational silicon circuitry. That intersection is where true magic happens.
I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, something to explore on your own as you look at the devices surrounding you right now. Throughout his early life, Steve Jobs desperately sought a spiritual guru. He starved himself, he wandered through the heat of India, and he meditated in Zen centers, all to help him achieve inner peace, dissolve his worldly attachments, and let go of his ego. Yet he achieved his absolute greatest historical success by doing the exact polar opposite, imposing his massive, unyielding ego, his manipulative reality distortion field, and his tyrannical control over every single microscopic detail of a commercial machine. Was the personal computer revolution actually born out of one man's spectacular failure to achieve Zen detachment?
It is a brilliant, lingering paradox to consider.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. Just like we started looking for that neat, logical, architectural blueprint of success, we found a beautiful, chaotic, deeply human mess instead. Keep questioning the blueprints around you and keep learning.